welcome to the deep dive. So for decades, cannabis had this heavy stigma attached to it in lots of places.
Definitely.
But now we're seeing quite a shift, aren't we? Decriminalization, even full legalization, like recently in Germany.
It's a big change. And, for a long time, as cannabis started gaining more acceptance, the conversation really tended to focus on the positives.
Yeah, the upsides.
Exactly. Often sort of overlooking or maybe downplaying the potential drawbacks.
Which is why getting a balanced view is so important now. Past discussions might have compared it favorably to, say, alcohol.
Yeah.
But the actual legal restrictions on cannabis, they made it hard to do deep scientific research on its long-term effects.
That's a really key point. Those legal barriers, they definitely limited the research, but that scientific landscape, it's changing fast now. We're getting new studies, giving us a much more, let's say, nuanced understanding. So that's what we're doing in this deep dive. We want to explore some of these recent scientific findings, try and paint a clearer picture.
Absolutely. And just to be clear, our view hasn't changed. Prohibition doesn't really work. Cannabis, like any substance, needs to be treated responsibly. You have to acknowledge both sides, the potential benefits and the risks.
Right.
So today, we're diving deep into that latest science. We'll look at the increasing THC levels, rising use, the realities of addiction and withdrawal, and what the science says about potential brain effects, especially for teenagers.
And this is all based on a pretty comprehensive recent analysis of the current science out there.
Okay, so let's get into it. Where do we start? THC.
Yeah, let's start with THC. Tetrahydrocannabinol, that's the main psychoactive compound in cannabis, right? The thing that causes the effects people feel.
How does it work exactly?
Well, it interacts with cannabinoid receptors. We have them throughout our brain. They're part of this bigger system, the endocannabinoid system, which helps regulate things like, mood, pain, appetite. And THC essentially sort of hijacks that system. But what's really striking, and what we need to talk about, is how much the potency of THC has increased.
Yeah, I've seen those numbers. It's pretty dramatic.
It really is. Over just the last few decades, US, Canada, Europe, the average THC concentration in cannabis, both legal and illegal stuff, has more than doubled.
Doubled, wow.
Yeah. And we're seeing these super potent strains being developed, plus things like edibles and concentrates. They can have upwards of 60% THC.
60%.
Right. And at the same time, the lower THC options, they're becoming harder to find.
And I guess the science suggests that higher doses make the negative effects worse.
That seems to be the case, yes. Many potential negative effects appear amplified with these higher THC doses.
Okay, so potency is up. What about how many people are actually using it?
That's also on the rise. It coincides with the potency increase. Look at the U.S. in 2022. For the first time, daily cannabis use actually overtook daily alcohol use.
That's a significant statistic.
It is. And in Canada, similar trend. In 2023, about 26% of people aged 16 and over said they used cannabis. That's up from 22% back in 2018.
So more people using, and the cannabis they're using is much stronger than, say, 50 years ago.
Exactly. More people using stronger cannabis than really ever before in the last century. That's the key takeaway here. It's a different landscape now. The risk profile has fundamentally shifted from historical use patterns.
Now, is this all because of legalization? Or is it more complicated?
It's not entirely clear-cut. The research findings kind of vary on the direct link between legalization and increased use. What's interesting, though, the trend of increasing cannabis use, it actually started before a lot of the big legalization pushes. We saw it starting back in the 90s and picking up speed in the 2000s.
Okay, so legalization might play a role, but it's not the whole story.
Doesn't seem to be, no. The bigger picture is a lot of people are using cannabis, and it's, on average, way more potent than it used to be.
Which brings us naturally to the topic of addiction.
Right.
Because for a long time, there was this idea, this sort of myth, that you couldn't really get addicted to cannabis.
Yeah, that it wasn't addictive, or at least not seriously. It was often dismissed.
But the science tells a different story now.
It reveals a more complex picture, definitely. Look, most users, maybe 8 out of 10, use cannabis pretty casually without major problems.
Right.
But about 2 in 10 do develop what we call cannabis use disorder, CUD.
CUD. Okay, what does that actually mean? Is it just liking it a lot?
No, it's more than that. It's a recognized condition. There are 11 specific symptoms. Think about someone who keeps trying to cut down but just can't manage it.
Hmm.
Or they keep using, even though it's messing up their job or their relationships. Maybe they need more to get the same effect tolerance. Or they feel bad when they stop withdrawal.
Right.
Those are the kinds of... Essentially, CUD means you're using too often, even when it's causing harm, and maybe even when it's not that enjoyable anymore.
So who's most at risk of developing this CUD?
Well, the research points to 3 main risk factors. First, the amount of THC you consume. Higher potency, higher risk.
Okay.
Second, how often you use. More frequent use, higher risk.
Makes sense.
And third, a big one, is the age you start using. Starting younger significantly increases the risk.
Younger age. So teenagers again.
Yes. And for about, say, 1 in 10 users overall, this can become a really serious addiction. We're talking daily use that significantly impairs their life. They might spend huge amounts of time using or recovering, and often, needing higher and higher doses because of tolerance.
What about the psychological side of heavy use?
It can be substantial. Studies show heavy users might experience more negative moods, irritability, restlessness, even paranoia, anxiety, or depression. And here's a tricky part.
Yeah.
Sometimes people feel they need cannabis to cope with those feelings, maybe because it helped initially. But in the long run, the heavy use often actually makes those symptoms worse. It can become a cycle.
A difficult cycle to escape, I imagine.
Very much so. And there's also this emerging link researchers are looking at between loneliness and frequent cannabis use.
Loneliness. How does that connect?
Well, it seems like they might feed into each other. Feeling lonely might make someone more likely to use cannabis, maybe as a coping mechanism.
Okay.
But then frequent cannabis use might actually contribute to loneliness. Maybe it makes social interaction feel harder or leads to withdrawing socially. It's a potential negative feedback loop.
Interesting. So beyond mood and social effects, what else happens with heavy use? I've heard people talk about feeling numb.
Yes, that mental numbness. Some heavy users report that because cannabis affects the brain's reward system, right? Things that would normally feel boring can become, well, acceptable, tolerable.
So less motivation to do things.
Kind of. You might just go through the motions, do passively entertaining stuff without really feeling joy or engagement. You know that signal boredom usually sends? Like, hey, be creative, learn something new.
Yeah.
That signal can get dampened down.
And I suppose that numbness makes quitting harder, too.
Exactly, because suddenly without the cannabis, those everyday routines feel incredibly bland, super unexciting. The contrast is stark, and it pushes you back towards using.
That makes sense.
And there's another angle, personal growth. Negative feelings, however unpleasant, often push us to reflect, to adapt, to change. If cannabis use consistently dulls those feelings, that whole process can be stunted.
Okay, so those are some psychological aspects. What about physical withdrawal? Is that a real thing with cannabis?
Oh, absolutely. And it tends to be worse the more you use and the higher the THC dose.
What kind of symptoms are we talking about?
Well, headaches are common, sweating or feeling chills. Appetite often decreases. And in more severe cases, you might even see fever, nausea, abdominal pain.
That sounds pretty rough.
It can be. Sleep gets disrupted too, trouble falling asleep, or having really vivid, sometimes disturbing dreams.
Emotionally?
Yeah, emotionally. Withdrawal can bring on a depressive mood, restlessness, anger, anxiety, just a general inability to function normally. It can feel pretty awful.
How long does that typically last?
Thankfully, the research suggests these withdrawal symptoms usually subside, generally within a few days, maybe up to a couple of weeks. It really depends on how much and how long the person was using.
Okay. Let's shift gears a bit. What about the brain itself? Long-term damage, that's always been a big point of debate.
It certainly is a complex area, and, it's important to say up front, there isn't a definitive consensus among all researchers about irreversible long-term brain damage for all users.
Right. It's not settled science yet.
Not entirely, but we do know THC directly messes with brain chemistry. There's some evidence suggesting it might even alter brain structure. Now, whether those changes are permanent or if they reverse when someone quits, that's still uncertain. We need more research there.
But are there known effects, especially for heavy users?
For heavy users, yes, the picture is becoming clearer. We see associations with significantly worse memory, reduced ability to learn new things, impaired reasoning, perception, attention span. Even decision-making and language skills can be affected. Impulse control, too.
That's quite a list. Do those effects go away if someone stops using?
The encouraging news is that many of these negative effects do seem to improve or even disappear entirely over time after quitting. But again, as I said, more research is definitely needed to understand the long-term picture fully.
Where does the evidence seem strongest then?
Where the evidence is substantially stronger and frankly more concerning is when we talk about cannabis use in adolescents, teenagers.
Because their brains are still developing.
Exactly. It's a critical period of development, which makes them particularly vulnerable. Heavy cannabis use during those formative years, it's linked to potentially more years suffering negative effects and a much higher chance of developing addiction, that CUD we talked about.
So the developing brain is just more susceptible.
It appears so. And there's a clear link, remembering correlation isn't causation, but a clear association between heavy teen use and things like poorer performance in school, lower educational attainment down the line, and generally lower life satisfaction.
It sort of makes intuitive sense, doesn't it? If your memory, your motivations are hit during those key years.
It could absolutely have lasting consequences, which, if you're a parent or young people, these findings really highlight why open conversations and education about the specific risks for adolescents are so crucial.
Absolutely. Is there anything else specific to teen use that's particularly worrying?
Yes. Perhaps the most concerning link is the strong evidence connecting heavy cannabis use in adolescence to a significantly increased risk of developing serious mental health issues later in life.
Like what?
Things like psychosis, schizophrenia, depression, and anxiety disorders.
Wow, a significantly increased risk.
Yes. And that risk seems even higher for kids who start using earlier, and especially those using high THC products, those potent concentrates and edibles we mentioned, particularly risky for teenagers.
Okay, so we've spent a lot of time here focusing on the potential negative sides of cannabis.
We have.
And it's important, I think, to repeat, the goal wasn't to, demonize cannabis. It was to provide that balanced perspective based on the science that's coming out now.
Exactly. And like we said earlier, for most adults using moderately, it's likely less harmful than, say, alcohol.
Right.
And actually, there's something to be said for moderation itself, isn't there? It can make the experience maybe more intense, more special, rather than just a constant background thing.
That's a good point. But the message for teenagers seems really unambiguous based on this research.
It really does. The potential for significant, even life-altering negative consequences from regular or heavy use during those years, it's considerable. The scientific consensus strongly advises against it.
Right. And we started by saying prohibition didn't work. Criminalizing cannabis didn't solve these problems.
No, in fact, it probably made them harder to study and talk about openly.
So maybe legalization, despite all its complexities, gives us a new chance. A chance for open, honest discussion guided by the science.
That's the hope, I think. Ultimately, cannabis is just one drug among many. It's not the worst one out there by any means.
But it's clearly problematic for a significant minority of users. You said, what, 1 to 3 out of 10?
Somewhere in that range, yes. That's a substantial number of people who struggle with it.
So, based on everything we know now about brain development, if someone does choose to use cannabis, waiting seems wise.
Waiting until their 20s, based on the